My name is Jason Wallace. I'm the pastor of Christ Presbyterian Church, and we welcome you to another installment of the Ancient Paths. It is our privilege to have with us this evening Sandra Tanner, the director of Utah Lighthouse Ministry, author of more books than I can count. I know it was enough to break my bookshelf some time ago, but she has been with us in the past and is back with us. It's always a great privilege to have you with us.
Glad to be here.
Sandra, Friday was September 11th, which was a day of mourning and remembrance for many people in terms of the great tragedy that happened 8 years ago. But September 11th is another anniversary as well, isn't it?
Yes, in 1857, on September 11th, we unfortunately had a great massacre in southern Utah where 120 approximately men, women, and children that were non-Mormons traveling through were massacred by the Mormons of southern Utah. And it's something that has haunted Mormons and Utah history ever since, and something that the Mormon Church has not fully taken responsibility for. They say they're sorry the event happened, but since it was all the priesthood leaders and leaders of the Mormon Church in southern Utah that perpetrated the massacre, it seems it's not sufficient to just say, oh, sorry.
Let's get a little bit of background here, because one of the things that I hear from a lot of LDS is that there is a sense that they have to be right because they've been persecuted, and there has been persecution. But when I look at, say, Hans Mill, I see that there were 14 Latter-day Saints killed there, and I forget, was it Cripple Creek was one of the battlefields there in Missouri, and they had, I think, 3 Mormons and 1 non-Mormon killed there. All of these really don't add up to the 120 that were killed there in southern Utah, do they?
No, what the Mormons like to bring up is the fact that the Mormons were driven out of different areas, and certainly many Mormon people suffered in being forced out of their homes in Missouri and in Nauvoo, in Illinois. But what the Mormons don't take into account is what their church leaders did to bring those events about. Now, the average Mormon was probably generally innocent of the events that took place, but their church leaders were the cause of a lot of problems for the Mormon people. Joseph Smith had early on said that, in the early 1830s, Joseph Smith was talking about God was going to give the Gentile lands around the Mormons to them, and that time was coming that the Mormons would have all the riches of these people. And there was a feeling that the Mormons were entitled to, like Israel coming in and taking over the land or something, that they were true Israel and God was going to give them the land. So as word of this type of attitude spread, the non-Mormons in the area became very concerned about the Mormons. Also, the Mormons voted as a bloc, and people don't understand how scary this would be in a community to suddenly have a whole bunch of people move in that all voted one ticket. Whatever way the leader said, that's the way they'd vote. This caused a lot of animosity toward the Mormons. Plus, the Mormons were Northerners. They were coming into Missouri, where it's mainly Southerners. And so there was a lot of suspicion against the Northerners. Early on, the Mormons had some favorability towards the blacks, and this caused concern for the Southerners. So there were different areas that started the non-Mormons worried about the Mormon presence. And then in Ohio, you had Joseph Smith started a bank, and the church got heavily involved in debt. They couldn't pay their bills. The bank collapsed. Joseph Smith had to flee the state. There were a lot of things that caused anger against the Mormons. So, yeah, they had a rough deal in a lot of areas, but some of it they brought on themselves.
Let's take this in a little bit of a chronology here. Now, as I understand it, there was some opposition in New York at the very beginning, but they weren't really driven out of New York so much as with the conversion of Sidney Rigdon in Kirtland, Ohio, and his whole congregation coming in, there was a shift of everything over that way with the receptivity and such. So
Right.
they didn't really get driven out of New York, did they?
No, that was a great opportunity for Joseph Smith when Sidney Rigdon, who was a minister in Ohio, joined Mormonism. He was influential in bringing his congregation into Mormonism. This gave the Mormons a jump start, if you will, in Ohio with a whole group of people ready to join in with them. But then they soon decided to expand into Missouri because the Mormons believed that the American Indians were true Israel and they were about to come into their own, and they wanted to do evangelistic work amongst the Indians. And so they started a settlement in Missouri as well. And these were things that really boosted the Mormon growth.
Now, the starting of the bank there in Kirtland, that was actually described by the people involved, both for and against Joseph Smith, that he announced that was by revelation.
Yes, right. And so when the bank failed, there were a lot of Mormons that were very disillusioned that, how could God's prophet set up a bank and have it fold? I mean, it'd be like Thomas Monson announcing an investment plan and everybody invests in it and then have it go belly up, and it would raise a great question in people's mind about his prophetic leadership. So Joseph's failed bank was a real problem for people.
One of the things that strikes me is that, there are banks that go out of business for a host of reasons, but this bank was issuing script that supposedly they had gold on reserve to back
Yes.
up, but they issued far more script than they had gold for. And so
Right.
people were including non-Mormons who had banked with them, were completely wiped out.
Right.
They had a bunch of worthless paper that there was no gold, and so the reason Smith ends up fleeing Kirtland is not so much religious persecution as he owes a bunch of money to people that he can't pay, and he literally flees in the middle of the night, doesn't he?
Right, yes. And the irony of it all is his Kirtland money now is worth more than it ever was because it's a collector's item with Joseph's signature.
They have a $3 bill.
Yes, Joseph's $3 bill.
Now, when we get into Missouri, we see a lot of opposition. You've already touched on some of the things there. But I think that, I've been reading about some of these things for years, and some of this has been new for me. So I was struck that there was so much dissension within the church. It seems like there is when Whitmer and others really had their falling out. After the fleeing from Kirtland, there are these dissidents, and you end up with Sidney Rigdon preaching the Salt Sermon and things like this.
Right. The Mormons had, because of the problems, they'd been driven out of Independence, Missouri in the early 30s. And so the state had set aside Caldwell County to be sort of a settling place for the Mormons. They were trying to hope to isolate the Mormons off in their own little community, and maybe that would solve the tensions. But as the Mormons kept infiltrating into the community, they started expanding outside of Caldwell. This caused worry amongst the people outside of Caldwell County. And then you had all of this failed prophecies of Joseph, like the banking and things like that, that began to concern people. Also, the rumors of Joseph's polygamy or affair, whatever you want to call it, with Fanny Alger. And so in 37 and 38, you have a lot of dissent within the Mormon church itself. And that's when the witnesses to the Book of Mormon, other than the Smith family, all pull out. And so David Whitmer, Martin Harris, Oliver Cowdery, these different important early leaders in the church pull out and oppose Joseph Smith. In fact, they flee out of the area for fear of their life because they're afraid the Mormons are going to do them in, feeling that they were somehow traitors because they disagreed with Joseph Smith on how he was handling things.
Now, part of all this in the 1838 time period is a also coincidental with the rise of Sidney Rigdon.
Right,
As
absolutely.
He ends up becoming first counselor?
Yeah.
Or
Yes.
first counselor in the first presidency. So he actually threatened the dissenters, like Whitmer, with hanging, didn't he?
Yes, the witnesses that these men fled the area for fear of their life, and they wrote later about this, that they were that afraid that the Mormons would kill them for standing against things Joseph was doing. And so you have Sidney Rigdon giving his famous sermon that they refer to it, that you had mentioned, the Salt Sermon, where he talked about if we have people come against us and stand against us, it'll be a war of extermination. We won't put up with this anymore. We're going to fight back. And so he uses this phrase of this war of extermination. Now that later gets picked up by Governor Boggs there in Missouri when he issues his infamous order to exterminate the Mormons. He is really echoing Sidney Rigdon's earlier statement about doing away with dissenters against the Mormons. So the Mormons always want to bring up Boggs and how dastardly he was, but they don't tell the part of what led up to Boggs' statement. Now, Boggs was obviously overreacting to the Mormon problem. The Mormons weren't that unruly or that big a problem that would have justified such an order. But unfortunately, by giving that order, you had then some of the citizenry of Missouri carrying it too far, and that's when you have the Hans Mill massacre that the Mormons like to bring up when their people got slaughtered. But it's all an outgrowth of these strifes that are going back and forth in the 38 time period of Missouri.
And I want to come back to this, but none of this was done in the name of Christianity in terms of the Hans Mill massacre or Cripple Creek or anything.
No, this was citizenry upset about the Mormons' way of life. They're infiltrating the community. They're disrupting everything. They're disrupting the voting. It's all sorts of things like this that are coming in.
I don't know if we have the graphic from last week. I actually didn't think about in preparing this, but Parley Pratt in 1838, as part of this whole response, made a very clear threat. He was responding to a critique of Mormonism written by a non-Mormon. And he threatened that within 5 to 10 years, this country was going to be scourged. And he said that if it's not largely overthrown within 5 to 10 years, the Book of Mormon will have shown itself to be false. I don't know if we have that graphic handy there, but and I don't see it. So, but here we go. I will state as a prophecy that there will not be an unbelieving Gentile upon this continent 50 years hence. And if they are not greatly scourged and in a great measure overthrown within 5 to 10 years from this date, then the Book of Mormon will have proved itself false. Now this is written by Parley Pratt, one of the 12 apostles, in 1838, at the same time as all this other is going on in Missouri. I think people underestimate how afraid some of the neighbors were of some of this kind of language, that they were looking for the end of the world, and they were looking for the destruction of all the non-Mormons, and made no secret of it. And they were actually, the Mormon battalion was larger than the standing U.S. Army, wasn't it?
Well, it was in Nauvoo. Yeah, when they got to Nauvoo, the Mormons had their own Army Legion, and it rivaled anything around. And Nauvoo was one of the biggest cities in Illinois at the time. So there were a lot of reasons for people to be fearful of the Mormons' political presence, of what they would mean in a community. If you just thought of some small farm community that you would know around the United States somewhere, and envision 2,000 to 3,000 people from some oddball religion suddenly moving in that all voted as a bloc, I can assure you the townspeople would be a little concerned about how this would affect things. And in fact, we had that in Oregon years ago. What was the name? Do you remember the name of that group that
Oh, the Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh.
Yeah, and so you have this
The Rajneeshis.
odd group that moves into town, and they control, pretty soon they can control the elections and everything. And you have the same kind of fear happening with the Mormons. They suddenly move into an area and become the predominant group. So you have a lot of political, economic issues involved here. The idea that the Mormons believed in the end time that God would give them the land. These were the issues more than the specific doctrinal issues of Mormonism.
So they end up fleeing from Missouri. They go to Nauvoo.
Yeah.
And there, Joseph Smith has the press burned of the Nauvoo Expositor because they're making accusations against him, accusing him of polygamy and things like this.
Yes, polygamy and plural gods, and his political aspirations. The Nauvoo Expositor was a paper that was put out by former leaders in the Mormon Church. This wasn't the non-Mormons in the community. These were Mormon people that had become concerned how Joseph Smith was progressing in his idea of taking over the world and setting up this political kingdom of God. They became concerned that this seemed like some sort of megalomaniac effort here, and outside of the directions of God in the scriptures, even by their standard of scriptures. So they set up this opposition newspaper. Now, the problem for the Mormons is that it was not a paper that was putting out libel, and that was the excuse the Mormons used for destroying the press, was it was printing lies. But what the average Mormon isn't aware of is what the paper was accusing is true. that was what was going on. He did have secret polygamy, he was teaching plural gods, and he did have a political agenda. All the things that were put forward in the paper turned out to be true. And yet Joseph ordered its destruction, and that set the ball rolling that would eventually force the Mormons to leave the United States proper, go out to Utah, which at the time the Mormons come west, Utah was not a territory of the United States, it was part of Mexico. So from the Mormons' position, they were leaving the United States. They were going into another country.
I've heard it said that there were actual expectations of being able to come here and then break away from Mexico like Texas did and form an independent country, state of Deseret.
Well, I'm sure they hoped to, yes, but it wasn't long after that that the United States was able to acquire it, and it became a territory of the United States. So the Mormons got fouled up on that one.
So the Mormons move here. Within 6 months, they find themselves back in the United States again because of the end of the Mexican War. And this desire for independence that may have played a role in things early on. Brigham Young made comments even early on in 47 that basically give us 10 years and we'll be ready, didn't he? I mean, there was actually an intention to withdraw from the United States.
Right, and not only that, once they became part of the United States territory, then you would find in their sermons, when they were talking about it, would soon come up about that the Brigham Young would be president of the United States and the apostles would be the different leaders of the country. I mean, they were all expecting that they were going to win the day and carry it forward, and if they weren't their own independent state, they would become the head of the United States.
Now, one of the things that a lot of people don't understand is that when the Mormons first moved here, when the pioneers arrived, there was no private ownership of property, was there?
No, the Indians didn't have a concept of ownership. I mean, it's not like this was just a vacant land. The Indians were around. They hadn't settled so much in the Salt Lake Valley. I think they were more down in the Provo area. But they used hunting up here, but they didn't have the sense of ownership of land.
No, I'm talking about the Mormon settlers didn't have private ownership
of... No, they were assigned, given their plots by the church, so it was a church deal.
But even when they were assigned plots to develop, they were never given title.
Well, the church didn't really have the right to give title.
But everything was still owned communally,
right,
through the church. And so one of the things that happens early on is that with the end of the Mexican War, you have Gunnison and others sent in to start surveying the area for homesteading.
Right.
Because the American idea of the frontier is you homestead it.
Right.
And so you need to survey it all, which means that now there's going to be this conflict between a communal ownership and individual ownership.
Yes.
And Brigham Young didn't actually cooperate with that.
No,
too much, did he?
well, he didn't cooperate with much of anything having to do with the government, and that was one of the problems all of the federal government had when they were out here, is that the Mormons always maintained their own way of doing things and ignored what the government was trying to lay down of the laws of how you did anything out here. And the Mormons says, well, if we don't want to do it that way, we just won't want to do it that way. So you had two systems going on about how you acquired land and how you ran the courts and everything else.
One of the lines of argument, it seems, in those early days was they were pushing for statehood, because I think that they had the same idea that you see with the South later on. You had seen it, the northern states had threatened to secede. Some of the New England states had threatened in the 1830s. South Carolina nullification crisis in 1832 had threatened to secede. You finally get secession of states in 1861. There's this tension. On the one hand, they want to go ahead and get statehood, but they don't really want to cooperate. But being in a federal territory, they didn't have any strong position, did they?
No, they're trying to play the government along. Once they realize they're going to be forced to be part of the United States as a territory, then they decide, well, okay, maybe we can get our own men into the offices and be able to use the system to our own advantage. And so Brigham Young becomes the territorial governor, and all of the Mormon leaders become appointed to the different territorial positions out here, which raises all the conflict with the government, because the government's sending out federal agents to try to run things, but the Mormons, under the guise of holding different offices here in the territory, would just do whatever they wanted, whether the federal officers agreed with it or not. It was a constant battle between the federal officers and the Mormon church leadership.
Well, by 1857, Buchanan had decided to remove Brigham Young as territorial governor.
Right.
What were some of the things that led to that decision?
My mind's gone blank. You'll have to fill in.
Well, basically, he was not cooperating with
Right.
their directives, and they were concerned about the reports that they were hearing. Polygamy was publicly taught from
That's
1852, and the word was getting back east that polygamy. All the rumors were now being confirmed that from 1852, polygamy is publicly being taught, and so Buchanan decides to remove him.
Right.
And understands that this.
Well, it's not just polygamy. It's the way the courts are being handled too. All the federal judges are furious the way the Mormon courts are run. That the Mormon juries just acquit whoever they want, and so you have this trouble in the courts all the time.
And there was also suspicion that when Gunnison and his party were murdered by the Indians, that Brigham Young, who's the Indian agent,
Yes.
Whether there's any evidence of that, that's another matter, but the suspicions back east were that Brigham Young was not happy with them, and the next thing they know, the Indians that he has good relations with have killed the survey party.
Right.
And so they decide to remove him, but that doesn't go so well, does it?
No. So you have these different federal officers going back to the United States government making reports about how the Mormons are in rebellion and they aren't obeying any of the laws. And they may have exaggerated things in their reports. But the President of the United States becomes concerned that we have to get a handle on this. And so the big problem is we have this Mormon leader being the territorial governor who seems to not care about the laws of the United States. We need to go in and put in someone who will enforce the laws. And so he decides to send out a new governor, and he sends out this army to help install the new governor because they're afraid of insurrection from the Mormons when the new governor arrives. And so with the word coming that this big army is marching out to Utah, then you have the Mormon church leaders preaching around through the territory that the government's coming out to rape our women and steal all our property and put us into servitude. And they had tremendous sermons being preached that would incite the people against the United States government, that this is more of the oppression that we, after all we suffered in the East, now they're coming out to inflict even greater things against us here in the territory. So there was a growing tension out here in Utah Territory between the Mormons and the non-Mormons.
So you've got the new governor coming in with Johnson's army supporting him. And word gets back here, and there are all kinds of preparations for the invasion, as they see it. And they're making preparations for armed resistance. They end up attacking the supply trains up in Wyoming.
Yeah, guerrilla warfare against the army.
And essentially destroy the supply wagons so that Johnson's army has to stay in Wyoming over the winter.
Right.
And can't come in.
Yeah, a lot of them about starved to death over that one.
And they were getting ready to fight through Immigration Canyon and snipers and everything else. Basically, I mean there was also talk about possibly removing to the Bitterroot Valley up in Montana and burning Salt Lake City to the ground. All this stuff. In the middle of all this, the Fancher wagon train comes into Utah, doesn't it?
Yes, but before the Fancher train gets here, you have a situation where a Mormon apostle by the name of Pratt.
Parley, the guy we just had his picture.
Parley Pratt, who was a polygamist. He, when he had been out in California at one time, he had met a woman out there who was married with children, and she converted to Mormonism and became estranged from her husband. And I believe he took the children, or had the children sent back to the grandparents in the Arkansas area. Anyways, this woman joins Mormonism. She comes to Salt Lake, and then in time, she wants to go back and reclaim her children. Well, Parley Pratt's going on a mission trip back to Arkansas, and so she goes along. She's now Pratt's wife, although she's not really divorced from her legal husband. They're separated, but she's not divorced from him. But she marries Pratt in polygamy. She's like, I don't know, wife number 12 or something. And so they go back to Arkansas. He's on a missionary journey. She's on an effort to get her kids. Well, the husband finds out that Pratt's back there in Arkansas, and he and another fellow track Pratt down and kill him. And word of Pratt's murder gets back to Utah. By July 24th celebration, I think the word had come back. Well, Eleanor McLean had, the wife, had come back to Utah and brought the word back that her husband had been killed. Okay, this becomes one of the added fuel to the fire that amounts to the Mountain Meadows Massacre, because you already had, with the death of Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram, Mormons swearing oaths in their temple ceremony in different places that they would avenge the blood of the prophets. Joseph and Hiram's blood needed to be avenged for the being killed the way they were. Well, now you have the added factor of another apostle that's been killed, and so they're really out to avenge the blood of the prophets now. So when this wagon train from Arkansas starts west, and the Mormons know that Parley Pratt had been murdered in Arkansas, they put these together and think, aha, these are the enemies. And then there was a rumor started that some of the people in the wagon train were from Missouri, where the Mormons had been driven out, and supposedly there were a couple of men in the group that had boasted about killing Joseph Smith. Now, whether those are true or not, we don't know, because all you have is the people, the Mormons after the massacre, telling us this. So how do you weigh that out, you know?
You know, I never put anything past human stupidity, but it doesn't seem like something that someone with reasonable intelligence would do, to go into an area where you're vastly outnumbered and boast about killing Joseph Smith. I mean, it just, it sounds like self-justification after the fact, you know.
Right. Sounds a little foolhardy for anyone to have done that.
Brigham Young also ended up justifying it that they were all diseased and had syphilis and other things, didn't he, as well?
Right. Yeah, there was reports from the Mormons after the massacre that the women were all prostitutes, and that you didn't need to feel bad about them dying because they were fallen women anyways. Well, actually, this wagon train was all just normal Christian families leaving their farms in Arkansas to start a new life in California. I mean, they were just a wholesome group of people from one town transposing their whole community to another, but they got labeled by the Mormons as somehow responsible for the death of Parley, and that there were people in the group responsible for Joseph and Hiram's death. So when this wagon train comes through Utah, the Mormons think they're about at war with the United States, and Brigham issues a law that they're not to give trade to any non-Mormons coming through unless they have special permission. Well, so no one would sell to these people. They're going, they've got hundreds of heads of cattle with them. They have evidently thousands of dollars because they're going out to set up new farms, and all kind of supplies, except they need food. They need flour and things like this when they come through Utah, but the Mormons wouldn't sell to them, which raised some real tensions. Now, the Mormons later, in justifying the massacre, said that the people in this wagon train, when an oxen died, that they poisoned it and that the Indians ate it and got sick and died, and that's why the Indians supposedly wiped out the wagon train. But even the Mormon scholars today concede there's no evidence that an oxen got poisoned or that any Indian died from eating any poisoned meat. It's all defense language after the massacre to justify it.
So the wagon train makes its way through Salt Lake,
Yeah.
heads south, gets down near St. George,
Right.
Mountain Meadows, and briefly what happens?
Well, at first, there's an attack made on the wagon, and evidently the plan was that they would get a bunch of the Indians to come help attack the wagon, and the white men with the Indians dressed up as Indians, and to make it look like more Indians were involved in this, and went out and attacked the wagon train. But the men were able to fight it back. A number of the non-Mormon men were killed in this first attack. But the wagon train formed a circle, made a defensive mound of dirt inside in that to protect themselves. And it went on for something like 5 days that these people were pinned down in this wagon circle, not having access to water. It was a very dire situation. They couldn't last very long held under these kind of conditions. And meanwhile, the Mormons in Cedar City are having meetings trying to figure out what to do with these guys and how to resolve this whole thing. And they conclude that these are people that all deserve death, and they had to be done away with, every one of them that could tell the tale. And so finally they devised a plan. And John D. Lee, who was a spiritually adopted son of Brigham Young, goes out with a lead group of men to the wagon train under a flag of truce, white flag, and under the guise of saying, we're here to help rescue you from the Indians. If you will surrender all your arms, and we'll put them all in a wagon so that the Indians will see that you're peaceful, and we'll put all of the wounded men that were people that were wounded from the earlier attack in the front wagons, and then we'll have the women and children, and behind that we'll have the men who are unarmed, and this will show the Indians that you're peaceful, and we'll escort you through this area where the Indians are so hostile so that you can get on to California. Well, what are the wagon train people going to do? They've been pinned down for days and hardly with no water at all. They're running out of ammunition, and they're running out of men. I mean, it's mostly women and children at this point. So what are you going to do when the guy comes into a flag of truce? So they agree to do this because it's their only hope of survival. They surrender their arms to the Mormons. The Mormons lead them out on this given day, September 11th. And as they're marching out, the women and children and injured people are in wagons that are going first, and the men are way back here with a Mormon man walking next to a non-Mormon man in single file back here. And as the women and children pass over the knoll, Indians and Mormons jump out of ambush and slaughter the women, children, and injured. At that point, the Mormon man turns to the non-Mormon guy next to him and just shoots him dead.
John D. Lee actually gives the command, doesn't he?
Yeah, do your duty. Or what?
Mormons, do your duty.
Yeah, and so some men tried to run away from this, and so it wasn't just instant for everybody. It took a couple of minutes to kill them all, but it was just a horrific, quick thing. And a few years ago, when the Mormons were putting up a new monument down in Meadows, the backhoe of the guy scraping down the land for the monument unearthed some of the skeletons from this, and brief forensic examination was done of some of the bones. And when they examined some of the skulls, they found that they had, I think, a boy they assumed about the age of 11 or 12 or something like that, who had showed that he had a bullet hole into the top of his head. And from the angle that it entered the skull, they figured the kid had to be kneeling in front of the person that shot him to get the angle that the bullet entered his skull. And you had this evidence from the skeletons that were examined at that time showing the front-on shooting into the head of these people. I mean, it just had to be the most horrible thing. Even the Mormon men, a couple days after the massacre, some of the Mormon men came back to the site, and looking out over the bodies, some of them said, I didn't realize there were so many women and children. I mean, this was 120 people, but the majority of this were women and children. Whatever you possibly could come up with a justification for killing the men, it certainly couldn't cover all of these women and children. And they killed every child down to the age of 6 or 7. Now, in Mormonism, they don't believe you commit sin until you're 8, and so they would have felt that a child under 8 would be innocent of any wrongdoing of the parents. However, they killed them even younger than 8 because they evidently wanted to make sure the child wasn't old enough to remember or speak or identify anyone. But even at the age of 6, children still remembered and did identify people that were involved.
And, you know, please, I hope people are clear on this. I'm not diminishing anything that was done to Latter-day Saints unjustly by anyone else.
Yes.
But the killing of Parley Pratt, the various things that happened in Missouri, none of them are being done in the name of Christianity and organized within churches, but this was actually coordinated from within the Mormon Church by the spiritual leaders and was done in the name of Mormonism itself.
Right. It was the priesthood leaders that carried this out. And all of the men obeyed because it was the spiritual leaders. Now, they were also the political leaders in the area, but they were all one and the same under Mormonism. The political leaders were the church leaders. But it was done under a religious justification to avenge the blood of the prophets, and the killing of the children over an age of accountability was all part of Mormon doctrine. If it were just a matter of self-defense or something, you wouldn't have had to kill all those little children.
We're going to flesh this out a little more, but I'd like to invite people to go ahead and call in if you'd like to join in the conversation here. Our phone number is 973-TV20. That's 973-8820. We have Sandra Tanner from Utah Lighthouse Ministries discussing the Mountain Meadows Massacre with us. Sandra, one of the big questions that people have is the role of Brigham Young. And I've heard it repeated over and over that there is absolutely no evidence that Brigham Young had anything to do with the Mountain Meadows Massacre, and that he actually deeply regretted it, that these were just a bunch of rowdies down in southern Utah doing their own thing.
Well, before the massacre happened, just days, a week before, he had met with the Indian chiefs and essentially told them that they could have the cattle of wagon trains passing south. And in saying that to those Indian chiefs, he was essentially setting up the scenario for the massacre to happen. When he didn't give the people a pass to go through southern Utah and be able to get any supplies, he was dooming them. When he sends George Albert Smith down through the southern territories preaching against the government and protecting our lands and our people and defending our religion and all these sermons that were given, he's setting up a scenario. When he gives all his blood atonement sermons, and these have to be factored in the motivation for Mountain Meadows Massacre, he was giving sermons saying that the apostate should be killed. The church needed to defend itself. And so these are all things that set up the scenario for the massacre. But then after the massacre, he does nothing to round up the perpetrators of this. It doesn't show an outrage of a leader that realizes somebody has done a great atrocity in southern Utah. He does nothing to find the children. He does nothing to try to return them to their parents. He does nothing to try to retrieve the money, the cattle, the goods of these families, nothing. In fact, when he does visit Mountain Meadows a little later, and he sees the little monument that the soldiers had put up when they had tried to bury some of the people from the massacre, it has a cross on it. And he goes, the men with him tear the cross down, and there was a sign on it that says, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. And Brigham Young says, when they tear the cross down off of the little display, he says, vengeance is mine, and I have taken a little. It shows an approval that God ordained this, that God would approve of this.
According to John D. Lee, and I believe there's one other witness that was there, he actually, when he sees the monument in 1861, he gives a Masonic sign.
Yes, he raises the arm to the square.
To the square, and when he does that, not only do they tear the cross off the monument, they scatter all the rocks. This had been built by the California militia that had been brought in after the replacement of him as governor.
Right.
We're going to take some phone calls now. We have with us Bill from Idaho. Good to have you with us, Bill.
How are you?
Doing well, thank you.
I just had a couple thoughts. First of all, that is not at all tolerated. And I don't accept it. But to hear you guys talk about it, and I'm LDS, it's something that you guys just completely, you have your point of view, but you bring in everything negative on a negative program. You bring in everything negative, and there's so much half-truths and partial truths.
Bill, can you justify?
Aren't really.
Bill, do you have a specific question? Or if you don't, then let me ask you. You say that we're giving half-truths and only the negative. Then what is the positive of killing 120 men, women, and children?
I'm not saying there was anything positive, and I don't think anything positive. I can see where it happened, but I've read quite a few books or some of the writings of Sister Tanner, and it's so many half-truths that I've read in there. Just
such
like
as?
Tonight, there's a lot of half-truths that are being brought out, and assumptions that aren't really true.
Bill, such as? What have we said tonight that's a half-truth?
Okay, everything that she has brought out is assumption because nobody was there, nobody saw it.
Whoa, wait a minute.
Saying this is the way it was, this is the way it was,
Bill,
on a negative aspect. Now, I would like to see it on the...
Bill, wait just a moment.
Go ahead.
The quote that she just gave was recorded in the journal of Wilford Woodruff.
I'm not talking about that
wait a
quote.
minute. You said everything she said. Now, what is it that she has said that is not true, that is a half-truth?
A lot of it.
Such as?
There's a lot of half-truths,
Bill,
and all of it is...
Bill, specifically.
I mean, it's just like me...
Bill, specifically.
Wait, just a second. It's like me saying that you were an adulterer. Now, that's my... If I said that, and I'm taking that out of assumption, I mean...
Bill, you're not...
I don't like you. If I said that, that doesn't make it true.
No, it doesn't. But Bill, what is undeniable is that 120 people, roughly, at least 120, were slaughtered, and we know that it was orchestrated by the LDS leaders. It has been been documented.
I know.
Do you believe that John D. Lee actually led the assault of Mormons against this wagon train? Do you believe that actually took place?
Yes, I do. I believe
okay, then
that.
what is the half-truth? Please be specific, because you're the one that's
trying to implement. Wait, just a second. The half-truth that you're trying to implement, and that nobody has any fact of, is that Brigham Young orchestrated it, and you've been. Both of you have been trying to put that out, but that's. That's just a half-truth.
All that we have said about Brigham Young so far is that he met, which is documented, with the Indian chiefs several days prior and told them they could have the cattle of any trains heading south, and the quote that is from Wilford Woodruff's own journal, who later becomes president of the church. What else have we mentioned tonight that is a half-truth about Brigham Young?
No, you
can write. Wait, Bill, listen to me for just a second.
Okay.
You can dismiss people out of hand by saying, well, that's just half-truths. But you have to back it up. You have to point out what the specific half-truth is. We have other callers in line. Please give me one specific half-truth that we have given tonight, something that is out of context, something that
Young, as far as him being the orchestrator, and I can see it in it. And
no, we have not made any specific things. What we have said is that Brigham Young was aware of it afterwards. She did not say that he organized it. She said that afterwards he did cover it up, and that is undeniable. He did not prosecute anyone. He helps to, I mean, we've not even discussed it, but he helps hide John D. Lee for years.
My great
But at any rate, Bill,
my great-great-grandfather tried to stop it.
Well, Bill, you've not specified anything you've asserted, and that's an untruth. But thank you for calling. We have other callers we need to get to, and anyway, appreciate you calling. We have with us Boyd from Eagle Mountain. Boyd, good to have you with us. Boyd?
Thank you. Thank you. You know, the thing is that I watched so many times that so many people use the Mormon Church to make a living off of what they've done. And as I sit here and looking at the Tanners and what they've been through, you know, it's a miracle that they have this opportunity to make all this money off of the fallacies of the Mormons, you know. And it seems to me the world is a situation that every 100 years everybody
Boyd,
you know.
Boyd, what fallacies has she given us this evening?
So over a period of time, why
Boyd?
The Mormons probably twice a week.
Hello, Boyd.
Ever since it came forth. But
Boyd, are you going to actually respond to my question?
The living is kind of humorous.
Boyd?
Like you've lived there or been there, you know.
I'm sorry,
what I mean?
Boyd, if you won't respond to my questions, I'm going to have to cut you off. Are you going to answer my question?
Sure, Ed, go ahead.
Boyd, what fallacies has Ms. Tanner put out this evening? Please be specific. Don't just give.
Acting like she lived there, but no, she's got all them records she's done, but she's making a living off of it.
Okay. And do you believe that everyone who disagrees with you must be in it for the money?
I believe that the people who spent their whole life documenting and doing the things that they've done, not only them, many people are doing it now. But it's kind of like a miracle for them to make a living off of the Mormons.
But in defense of myself on this, you have BYU professors writing books on their position, and no one raises the charge that they're just in it for the money. I don't understand why someone can't put out another point of view without being charged with doing it for money. Authors write books on both positions, both sides write books. I'm not arguing that all the Mormon authors are doing it just for the money. I don't see why this comes up all the time for me. Anyone that knows me knows I live a modest life, and it is so silly to make that charge. They make it out of total ignorance.
We had a lady that was leaving the Mormon church, and she went to see her bishop because of some of the things that she had heard from me. And you know, we try to be careful. We don't bash. We don't try to tear down. What we do try to do is be clear about what the facts are,
Right.
and be clear about who the God of the Bible is, what the gospel of the scriptures is. And these are radically different from what is taught in LDS. And he basically said, you shouldn't listen to anything he says because he's just in it for the money. He probably pulls down $300,000, $400,000 a year. And she said, is that true? And I said, we're supported within the local congregation. I said, you do the math. At the time, we had a number of people move away. I think we had probably 35, 40 folks in our congregation at the time. And I said, do you realize how much that is for every man, woman, and child in the congregation? No. I was making more money 10 years ago doing other things. People can't fathom that I actually care about the people of Utah enough to leave my home, leave my family. We buried both our fathers since we've been out here. And we do it because we're trying to serve the Lord Jesus Christ. And yes, I make enough to feed my family and keep a roof over my head. But this is the way to dismiss people and never deal with the facts, never deal with the truth.
Well, even on the Mountain Meadow Massacre, even the Mormons' own books that they've just brought out on the massacre by Turley, what is the name of their book? Massacre at Mountain Meadows or something like that.
Something like that.
Whatever. Anyways, they concede that there was nothing done to justify the massacre. They admit that there wasn't the poisoning of the oxen. They admit everything, that it was the Mormon leaders that instigated the whole thing. So they aren't that far removed from what Will Bagley says in his book, other than Will's a lot harder on Brigham Young than they are. But the general outline of the massacre is pretty well conceded by most historians today.
We're going to squeeze in a few more calls here. We're unfortunately running out of time. Every time I get you on, it's like we just get to the good part and it's already over. We're going to squeeze in a few more. We've got Jason from North Salt Lake. Jason, good to have you with us.
Hey, sorry, I got a cough. Oh, okay.
If you don't like us, please be specific, because we've got 4 minutes left.
Hey, anyways, I was going to suggest a show idea. Nobody talks about the Hoffman thing that happened.
Oh.
We're going to be doing something.
Because, yeah, there's still witnesses and everything, and the reason why I say that is because, you know, it happened modern day. I mean, you guys, it's cool to talk about, you know, the stuff that happened back, you know, 100 years ago with the Mormon Church, but, you know, there's just nobody's alive. There's nobody to, you know, it's hard to prove all that stuff, and it's just there's something that happened, you know, modern day.
Keep watching. We're going to be going that direction. Hey, appreciate the phone call.
I have this book. It's called Mormon Murder. That's why I got into it, because I was a little kid.
Yeah.
And I remember it happened in the 80s, but then I started picking up this book and reading it off and on. And there's actually a picture of Sandra Tanner from 1985.
Right.
And it says,
like
writers
yesterday,
and
but
publisher Sandra Tanner and
we all
Gerald
look
Tanner,
different
they
back
have
then.
lived in fear of this moment ever since they began their crusade of information against the Mormon Church. And I was like, oh, you're on, you know, and I was just like, we got to get into, I got to, information, as many witnesses as you can bring on the show that remember all that and that experience that.
We're going to try to get something on before the end of the year. Keep watching. We're going to squeeze in another phone call. Appreciate the call.
Thank you.
We got, our lines are filled up, but we've only got time for one more call. We have Craig from Taylorsville. Craig, good to have you with us. If you could please be concise, we're almost out of time.
All right.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I could be very concise. What I wanted to say is, bottom line, I had a great-great-grandfather who was a missionary companion of Wilford Woodruff's in Nova Scotia. And he later on became involved in the Nauvoo Legion, played the drums and what have you. But the feeling I'm getting, and it took a long time, is basically what the members of the LDS Church need to do is basically study the history, not the scriptures, but the history, and the scholars who have delved in to the things that have actually gone on. And I don't think they're out trying to make a quick buck. I think they're just trying to reveal the fraud and the things that have gone on in the LDS Church that people just basically go on blind faith, and you can't do that.
Yeah.
You cannot do that.
Hey, we're just about out of time. Really appreciate.
I'm just saying that we need to, encourage them. I'm sorry, I can't hear you. But anyway, we need to encourage them, the members of the church, to basically just study the history, and if they want to really get in tune,
hey, I
go down
really
to the
appreciate
Lighthouse Ministry and start with maybe a book by Fawn Brody, No Man Knows My History, and then take it from there.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, we are unfortunately already at the end of our show. We do encourage people to read the history because Joseph Smith claimed that all the churches were wrong. Specifically, he says Presbyterianism is not true. Pearl of Great Price still records that. We communicate these things because we want there to be an examination so that the truth can be compared, so that people will go back to the Bible and read it for what it really says. It has been a great privilege to have with us Sandra Tanner this evening. Sandra, I'm going to run out of time if I thank you too much here. Would like to invite you to visit with us. We are a congregation of the Orthodox Presbyterian denomination. We meet Sunday mornings at 11 a.m. and 5:30 p.m. at 8630 West, 2700 South. If you'd like more information, you can go to the TV website, ancientpaths.tv, or to the church website at christpres.net. Our phone number is 801-969-7948. Hope to see you again next week. Until then, the Lord's blessings. Good night. Hear, oh, hear.